Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. I am your host, Joe Kuzma, and as it's become a tradition here to start the show, I had to give a shout-out because this is the whole reason this show exists today. Twitter handle at Steel_Curtain4, also known as Blitzberg. If you happen to follow those fine folks who run the account over there, if not, please do, because they're always sharing some really positive, really cool Steelers stuff. And I have to admit, I would have missed this one had I not been following Blitzberg over on Twitter. ESPN, on their NFL Live show just a day or two ago, decided to rank the best triplets in the NFL. And by triplets, I mean a trio of the quarterback, running back, and wide receiver. Now, most of you are probably thinking like I am. Who is better in the NFL than the trio of Ben Roethlisberger, Le'Veon Bell, and Antonio Brown? That's a very tall order to fill, but apparently ESPN, being the great sports experts that they are, and whoever makes these lists, charts, rankings, or whatnot, found four other combinations of triplets better than the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's right. They believe that the Pittsburgh Steelers are only the fifth best triplets in the NFL. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And man, if you weren't lying there, Chris, who I was speaking with, who helps run that Blitzberg account, I said, you know what? This is an article over on SteelCityUnderground.com already. And I'm going to have to talk about this on the show because these type of things get right underneath my skin. I don't understand exactly what it is that the Steelers have to do to gain respect. Maybe the city of Pittsburgh needs to have about 30 million people, so they're larger market or largest market in the country. You know, I don't even know how many people are in like New York City or Boston, Chicago, Dallas. Now we're going to have to deal with L.A. as far as us NFL fans. How painful is that going to be that they're going to be shoving the Rams down our throat now when they're just a pitiful NFL franchise? At least they have been for the better part of a decade. And now you have this. I don't know what it takes for Pittsburgh sports to get the respect that it deserves. You have NBC. They weren't even airing some of the Stanley Cup playoff games on regular NBC. I mean, I think they feel, some of those executives over there feel that they could get more mileage out of Friends reruns or something of that nature. I don't know. They had something completely awful on, and you end up watching on NBC Sports, at least for those of you who have the ability to watch NBC Sports. I know that was also a problem for some of my Northeast Ohio friends who couldn't catch some of these Pens games because they don't get NBC. But back to football. Let's evaluate the triplets that they believe are better than the Steelers, okay? Number one, and coming in number one, this is the reason why I said large markets. The other three on this list really aren't very big markets, at least maybe not better than Pittsburgh or something of that nature, but Dallas Cowboys, okay? The ESPN talking heads believe that the combination of Tony Romo, Ezekiel Elliott, and Dez Bryant are the best trio in the NFL. Do you know how ridiculous it is to make the Dallas Cowboys number one? I mean, there's a few others on this list. I can at least respect where we're going. But the Dallas Cowboys, Tony Romo plays 4 games last season. He throws more interceptions than he does touchdowns. Dez Bryant has a total of 31 catches in 9 games last season, and Ezekiel Elliott has never even touched a football in the NFL yet, okay? He's in these camps and stuff. He was just drafted. We have seen guys go as high as, just recent memory, The Cleveland Browns took Trent Richardson number 3 overall. I think that was the 2012 draft. Where's Trent Richardson now? How many teams has he been on besides the Browns? The Colts couldn't cut it with the Raiders. Now he's trying to hang on with the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. And I don't mean any ill will, because a lot of you know that I'm also very supportive of Buckeyes football, and being a former Ohio State alumni now, Ezekiel Elliott. You know, I rooted for him a lot, and now I'm not going to be able to root for him as much in the NFL. The Steelers are going to be playing the Cowboys this year. We're going to see how that turns out if Tony Romo stays healthy. But we saw last year, not necessarily without DeMarco Murray, even that great Dallas offensive line that they have now didn't produce a major runner. Joseph Randle had his own problems. He's not in the NFL anymore. Darren McFadden, that guy can't stay healthy for 2 consecutive weeks in a row. He actually did a little bit better in Dallas this year than what was accustomed of him when he was playing with the Raiders. But once again, he's on the shelf, and they hope to have him back for the preseason. I think he had some type of minor surgery. Probably one of these little maintenance things. I don't think he actually got injured. I think it's one of those maintenance things like I was talking about with Ladarius Green. So I'll cut McFadden a little bit of slack there. But still, he didn't have this amazing season. And then you look at the Cowboys. They go out. Do you think they're really sold on Zeke Elliott when they go out in free agency and pick up a division rival running back, Alfred Morris? I mean, maybe that's just to weaken the enemy. But Alfred Morris, the former 1,000-yard rusher himself, there's a lot of carries to split around. I'm not even sold that the Dallas Cowboys think that Zeke Elliott is a starter, let alone an every down back. So if you don't have somebody that can be an every down back, how can they be the best triplets? And you look at Dez Bryant. Like I said, 9 games, 31 catches. Antonio Brown, folks. Antonio Brown had 33 catches. Let me pull this up here. I'm trying to think the 2 games. I think it was the Cleveland Browns and the Oakland Raiders. Yeah, here we go. Antonio Brown caught 33 passes in those 2 games combined, 17 and 16. And Dez Bryant can only get 31 in 9 games. And mind you, Antonio Brown last year didn't always have his quarterback throwing the ball either. So what's the excuse for Dez Bryant? You can't catch balls from Matt Castle, or I'm not sure if Brandon Weeden and him were on the same field at the same time. Whatever other guys the Cowboys threw behind there. And then, of course, Romo does come back and gets hurt in that Thanksgiving game. Almost as soon as he's back, he's right back on the shelf. So I really did. The reason I'm mentioning all the injury stuff is I really thought that the Steelers were labeled as 5th just because Ben Roethlisberger has been banged up, and Le'Veon Bell, of course, has had some very major injuries over the last 2 years. Although, of course, last season was the only season where his season was cut short. He just didn't get to play in the playoffs the previous season. He had played all 16 games and got hurt in the final game the year before that. So I don't know how that label would work, especially when you're considering some of the guys that are listed coming up, such as number 2, the Arizona Cardinals trio of Carson Palmer. And now it just says Johnson, and I was leaning on whether that would be Chris Johnson or David Johnson, and it wasn't very specific. And as I said, I missed this show. I was trying to catch some highlights. I'm looking for other people that were reporting this on the internet, and really nobody was very specific. But you know what? You could take Chris Johnson, David Johnson, wrap them up real nice into a neat little ball, one little package, and they're still not a Le'Veon Bell. They're not even a DeAngelo Williams. And then, of course, Larry Fitzgerald, the longtime wide receiver there, who had been largely inconsistent for the better part of 5 years. As it turns out, Larry Fitzgerald hadn't had a 1,000-yard season since 2011 up until last year. He is 32 years of age. It's the 3rd time in his career that he has caught 100 or more passes, and he looked like he was just in decline. The previous year he caught 63 balls. That's not bad with 2 touchdowns, but you know what? There's guys like Marcus Wheaton that's like our 3rd best wide receiver option. In fact, Heath Miller caught somewhere between 50, 60 balls last season as a tight end. And you think about just how many attempts that Carson Palmer had, and you can make an argument for Carson Palmer, but Carson Palmer had a history of injuries just leading into the last season. He seems like he's like a perfect fit out there in Arizona, but he got rocked and only played like 6 games in 2014. So last season was a lot better for Palmer, who had 4,600 some yards, 35 touchdowns, and only 11 interceptions. So Ben Roethlisberger's interceptions were up last season, but then again, just all considering, and I'm going to get to the Steelers and how they compare here in a second, so I'm just going to hold off on that. But the two running backs, when it comes to Chris Johnson and David Johnson, Bruce Arians was so adamant that he did not want David Johnson taking too many carries as a rookie that he went out last preseason in the middle of August and signed Chris Johnson after the guy he proclaimed to be the starter, Andre Ellington, was a little bit banged up, and Ellington still kind of lost his role out there after being, he was a pretty decent back. But even if you throw Ellington into this mix as opposed to the two Johnsons, I don't think either of those guys are better than Bell or even DeAngelo Williams for that matter, at least in the Steelers offense. So I'm just going to downplay the fact that, Larry Fitzgerald, you want to say, well, they had inconsistent quarterback play for however many seasons that he was out there. He had guys like, I don't know, Derek Anderson was maybe throwing the ball there for a little while, and they tried a few different experiments before I think Kevin Cobb was one of the guys they traded for from Philadelphia. You remember that guy? That's bringing up a blast from the past, right? So, okay, Larry Fitzgerald is such this great player. Look what Antonio Brown does when he has Michael Vick and Landry Jones out there. And with Michael Vick, maybe AB didn't have the greatest of rapport, but he still put up some pretty solid numbers, even with Landry Jones. And even the spot service where you had maybe those two guys, they did a combined 4 full games, but there was also a short period of time there where Vick was playing in that Rams game, and Jones came in a few spot places here or there throughout the regular season. Included a really boneheaded interception call, the one I still don't agree with Cam Chancellor getting that ball from Martavis Bryant. However, just to stay on track here, and speaking of the long ball, the Carolina Panthers are another unit. They have them ranked 3rd ahead of the Killer Bees here. And it's one that, of course, I'm not going to agree with any of these. Number 4, I think, has maybe the best argument. We'll get there in a second. But number 3 being the Panthers with Cam Newton, Jonathan Stewart, and Kelvin Benjamin. Now, if this doesn't light a fire under your butt, I say the Yinzers are going to yinz. And everything else, I am sure yinsing right now. Jonathan Stewart is a guy that's he's a guy that's always banged up and not healthy either. He didn't even rush for 1,000 yards last season. And it's something he's only done once in 8 years in the NFL, all the way back in 2009. And, of course, he was in a timeshare with DeAngelo Williams before Williams left and became a Pittsburgh Steeler last year, which should have opened the doors and the floodgates for this guy to just they're run it down everyone's throat. But Jonathan Stewart's not a pass catcher, and despite having a 15-1 record, it was mostly based on the passing game and Cam Newton living up to his Superman nickname. Cam has about 3,800 yards passing in 2015, and he had his best touchdown-to-interception ratio of his career with 35 touchdown passes to 10 picks. However, he's still largely inconsistent. He finished with a 59.7% average, which is in line with his 59.5% career average, and his career best has been 61.7% of completing passes in 2013. Now, we're going to compare some other Steelers quarterbacks to those numbers. Michael Vick and Landry Jones are both in that ballpark. In fact, Michael Vick last season, for as much as we thought it was like having one of your teeth pulled to watch him throw the ball, and he got lucky with some defensive backs who didn't pick surefire interceptions. I remember, I think the one for sure was during that Chargers game when it was just dropped. But Michael Vick, believe it or not, still had 60.6% of his passes completed. That's better than Cam Newton. And Landry Jones wasn't too far behind the 59.7 that Cam, the Superman, put up with 58.2. Just a little over, maybe 1.5% drop between Landry Jones, effectively the fourth-string quarterback on the Steelers depth chart, after Bruce G goes down in the preseason last year. That should blow your mind. This team, the Carolina Panthers, was in the Super Bowl. Now, how do we even talk about Kelvin Benjamin? Kelvin Benjamin didn't even play in 2015. He was not even there last year, but they're giving him an awful lot of credit based on one rookie season that was actually not too bad, but he had 73 receptions with 1,008 yards and 9 touchdowns. Antonio Brown, as a starter, his worst season, and I think I'm going like a season or two into AB's career where he actually does play and has some starts. So he has 66 catches for 787 yards and 5 touchdowns. So 4 less touchdowns, about 250 yards less than Kelvin Benjamin, and we're looking at roughly 7 less receptions, although he had 5 less starts compared to Kelvin Benjamin. Yeah, you see where I'm going here. You have a guy in Zeke Elliott that hasn't even taken a snap in the NFL yet. You have a guy in Kelvin Benjamin who didn't take a snap for all of last season, and they're part of the best trios, better than the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the team that's at number 4 that I said I give at least a little bit of respect to, but you have to downgrade them compared to previous years. 2015 was a down year for Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. They come in at number 4 with Aaron Rodgers, Eddie Lacy, and Jordy Nelson. Now, Jordy Nelson's another guy that, you know what, he's a great wide receiver. I can't say that Kelvin Benjamin's a great wide receiver yet. He has 1 year for a body of work over 15 games that he started. At least Jordy Nelson has several years that you could compare with, and you could say, hey, you know what? Jordy Nelson got a huge payday. Jordy Nelson has been on fire when he is out there on the field. Unfortunately, he lost a year due to an injury, which coincidentally for this, at least this topic of conversation, happened when the Steelers and Packers faced each other in the preseason last year. I was there. It was a hot, miserable day. That was the one where Marquise Pouncey also went down. It was just a lot of bad luck for both squads. But once again, you're going to play somebody. Okay, we could at least go on a little bit of a history lesson with Jordy Nelson. Aaron Rodgers. Nothing wrong with saying Aaron Rodgers is a fine quarterback. I'm still not exactly happy that the Packers beat the Steelers in the Super Bowl several years ago. But you know what? I could at least respect where someone's coming from with saying that Jordy Nelson and Aaron Rodgers are very good, but the comparisons stop there when you bring Eddie Lacy into this conversation, someone who shows up with the season last year out of shape, slow start, benched for James Starks, who almost had the same kind of numbers as Eddie Lacy. So it's not as though the Packers don't have a formidable rushing attack, but we are talking about triplets. We're talking about 3 specific players, a group of 3 players that are better than a group of another 3 players. And we'll always have the Eddie Lacy, Le'Veon Bell comparisons for them being drafted only X amount of picks apart several years ago, both going in the second round. In fact, I thought the Steelers were going to go get Eddie Lacy. They get Le'Veon Bell, and I'm more than thrilled with how that's turned out. But it turns out Lacy he only ran for 758 yards and scored 3 touchdowns. He only caught, again, another guy like Jonathan Stewart. He only caught 20 passes, 188 yards. He did have 2 receiving touchdowns. Bell plays in 6 games last year, okay? Not the 12 games that Lacy starts. So Lacy runs for 758 and Bell runs for 556. About 200 less in half as many games. He scores the same amount of touchdowns, and he catches 4 more passes, but maybe about, we'll just call it a half a buck less in yardage, but in half the amount of games. If you were to be conservative and even ramp those numbers up 50%, and say Bell plays 12 games, not even a full 16, he far surpasses the productivity of Eddie Lacy. I'm sorry, you may as well just put James Starks in there. And in fact, had you even wanted to compare another guy and just toss it in there, let's just take Bell out. You're not going to give Bell any respect as a runner or receiver with this group. You're not going to give Antonio Brown, a guy who has shattered records. In fact, a future Hall of Famer in Ben Roethlisberger just never seems to get the respect of some of the same quarterbacks in the league. Look, Andy Dalton was just named number 35 in the NFL's top 100, that show that they run on NFL Network where the players vote. And Le'Veon Bell was number 41. Now, you might argue that the Steelers aren't going to be as bad off if they lose Bell, because we saw what could happen with DeAngelo Williams out there, and you saw what happened to the Bengals when they lose Andy Dalton. So that's just saying one team, as a unit, is maybe better than the other. I could be cool with that if you're going to just say that Dalton's more valuable to his team. But as an overall top 100 players in the league, Le'Veon Bell better be in the top 10. There aren't very many running backs that are on the same pedigree as Le'Veon Bell. I'd say maybe Adrian Peterson might be a name that's up there, but it is purely a rusher. Adrian Peterson comes out of the game on third down. Le'Veon Bell does not. It does not work that way. When you look at the statistics and see that Jonathan Stewart ran the ball 242 times and Le'Veon Bell ran it 113, you could double Le'Veon Bell's attempts and say he gets the same amount of yards. He's still just double his numbers, and he's still better than Jonathan Stewart with still not even as many attempts. That would be 226 attempts, and he'd have over 1,000 yards, and he would equal the same amount of touchdowns. DeAngelo Williams actually is a very good specimen for this, because he starts 10 games, he dresses in 16, doesn't necessarily get a carry in every game when Bell's out there, has 200 attempts, 42 less than Stewart, has 907 yards, just about 80 yards less, but he scores 5 more touchdowns than Jonathan Stewart. He catches 40 passes to Stewart's 16 and Lacy's 20. He has 367 yards receiving. Chris Johnson, he runs the ball just 4 times less and in 1 game less than DeAngelo Williams, and has almost 100 yards less. And still, again, only 3 touchdowns, 6 catches, 58 yards. This list, this trios thing, is an absolute joke. If I have to go with Ben Roethlisberger, Ben's interceptions were up a little more last year, but you compare him even to somebody that's supposedly great like Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers attempts more passes, actually 103 more passes than Ben Roethlisberger. He doesn't even have as good of a completion percentage, 60.7 to Ben's 68. He doesn't throw for as many yards as Ben. He throws 3 more touchdowns. Or, I'm sorry, not 3 more touchdowns, 10 more touchdowns. He throws a few less interceptions, but he's sacked 26 more times and has a 92.7 quarterback rating to Ben Roethlisberger's 94.5. I've already taken Carson Palmer pretty much out of this equation. He's thrown for a lot of yards, but again, less accurate, more attempts, less completions. He's thrown 11 picks to Ben's 16. And I already talked about Cam Newton, and Tony Romo is someone I don't even care to acknowledge. So the last guy on this chart really is Antonio Brown, who is just shattering records across the league. The guy has these mammoth games. He catches 136 passes for 1,834 yards and has 10 scores, large and above the best wide receiver of this group. You can make an argument and just look at statistics with Le'Veon Bell. You toss Le'Veon Bell out of there and put DeAngelo Williams in. The Steelers are still the best set of triplets in the NFL. You look at the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2014, those killer bees, all 3 of them, set franchise records all across the board in their categories between passing, rushing, and receiving. I just do not buy it. I think that ESPN is just ignorant. It is a giant screw-up. Whoever is responsible for this list just has a blatant disregard for what could be one of the best offenses in this league this year, because you can interchange different names. We could have put Martavis Bryant in here with his numbers from last year in place for Antonio Brown, and he's still better than guys who weren't on the field, like Des Bryant, barely on the field, and 2 guys that weren't even in football for all intents and purposes last year. Ladies and gentlemen, Thank you for listening to me on my soapbox. If you happen to agree with me wholeheartedly, come find us over on Facebook.com/Steel City Underground. Find us once again on Twitter over at Steel City Undergr. That's a GR. It's just no vowels there at the end with the E's and whatnot and the O's. And once again, a shout out over to Blitzberg. Thank you for the motivation. It was certainly helpful. Once again, I appreciate you guys supporting the Steel City Underground podcast. Don't forget, if you're listening on YouTube, click on the subscribe button. If you're not listening on YouTube, what are you waiting for? Come over, hit the subscribe button. We still share some other cool videos there. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, be safe, be good, and I will catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.